Hello and welcome to Heart Yoga Radio. Well, today's been full of fun and games. Just before we left the house to go and do our podcast and nails, we got the absolute up-to-the-minute latest breaking news to make sure we were completely up to speed with what we were going to talk about. We went round the hill and we recorded the podcast, and then when we got back 2 hours later, the Tories had U-turned so fast that part of what we had talked about was well out of date already. So we're recording a little thing on the front here just to mention this, because otherwise when you're listening to the podcast you'll be going, oh, this is a bit out of date, that didn't happen, it was all different. But it just happened so fast, and it just made me laugh a lot when we came back and they'd yet another highly embarrassing U-turn that they'd been forced into.
So here's the detail of how our podcast was out of date. We reported in the podcast what we'd heard on Sky News just prior to leaving the house, and also what we'd heard early in the morning on Radio 4, that Javid, the Secretary of State for Health, had been tested positive for COVID, and because he'd been in meetings with colleagues in the Cabinet the previous day, that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, at least those two, had been pinged by the app and instructed to isolate for, I think it's a week or 10 days. It was then announced that Johnson and Sunak wouldn't be isolating because number 10 Downing Street were taking part in a trial of a testing regime in which people are tested when they get to work in the morning with a rapid test. And if they return a negative test, that they can actually go into work. And I presume if they get a positive test, that they go home then and isolate, or whatever's appropriate. And we report in the podcast that the media were making the point that this was a bad look, and that it looked very much like a one rule for them and another rule for us. Again, there have already been numerous occasions on which this has been levelled against the government, starting with Dominic Cummings' infamous trip up north. And that was the state of play when we left the house, because when we got back, everything had changed, and it had been announced that Johnson and Sunak would, after all, isolate. And the word in the media is that this was a result of quite a lot of pressure coming their way from social media. Now, I did then have a look at Twitter, and there does seem to be a lot of activity around this issue and a lot of opinion from many sides of the political spectrum that yes, this does look like one rule for them and another rule for everybody else. Anyway, it's no reason not to listen to the podcast. That is only one kind of small fragment of it. And there is in the podcast a general point made, and our analysis seeks to bring out some generalities and some methods of analysing that we can use in all kinds of situations. And of course, current affairs do shift very, very rapidly, and especially when you live in interesting times as we do. Anyway, here it is, for your delight and edification.
Hello and welcome to Heart Yoga Radio. So, interesting times are still happening, and here is our next episode, particularly concentrating on the pandemic, because tomorrow is Freedom Day! Hurrah! Freedom for the virus to replicate exponentially and mutate to its heart desire. It's a wonderful, wonderful day for the virus tomorrow. So we're particularly talking about the lifting of restrictions, which our wonderful new Health Secretary Javid has come up with, which really feels a lot like throwing all the progress that we've made just straight into the bin. And given that there was a YouGov poll asking the question, would you like masks to remain mandatory on public transport, public spaces, shops, etc. And 71% of people want the masks to remain in place.
Yeah.
Now, it seems that Javid is taking a massive risk in many respects, not only with the health of the nation, of course, but politically for himself and the Tory party in general, to be going very much against the flow of what the public actually want for their own safety. So why is he doing this? So I've been looking into Javid himself, and it would seem that he openly admits that he's a Randian and reads the Ayn Rand books every year. Seems to be pretty much devoted to this ideology. I knew a little bit about Ayn Rand, but not that much, so I decided to start digging into it to see if I could just have a little window into the mind of this person who's making big decisions about my life. So where I've got to so far is, in a nutshell, Ayn Rand strongly believed that selfishness was a virtue.
So it chimes in very well with Thatcherism and neoliberalism, you know, which is premised on the idea that there is no such thing as society, only individuals. It's highly individualistic, isn't it?
Yes, and you should only do things that benefit for yourself, like thus the selfishness. And Ayn Rand herself was completely, she sort of saw the welfare state and socialised healthcare and social care as some sort of evil, actual evil.
The work of the devil.
Yeah. Very. I mean, really, if you were to allow Rand to create the world completely in line with her ideology, it would be extremely dark dystopia. The only people who would be having a good time would be the rich people, because they would be completely at liberty to indulge any whim that they wanted, whilst being comfortable in the knowledge that they were virtuous people. They would still allow them to feel like they were good people, feel good about themselves, no matter how much harm or suffering they were causing other people, because they were living up to this ideology where their happiness, their own personal happiness, was more important than anything else. It was the shining jewel that they had to attain. So for a rich person, that's quite easy, you know, but
this is clearly a demented ideology.
Yeah, oh God, it's absolutely bonkers, you know, and that, you know, if you're old and poor, you should basically just die in the gutter as nature intended, right? But the thing is that once Rand had to actually live her own ideology, she didn't like it, because in her later years she became very ill, and she'd used all the money building up this massive cult round herself, which I've also been looking into, which was just astonishing. Full-on cult, absolutely horrible. But that aside, she spent all the money on her cult and her medical bills, so she ended up with the last few years of her life
on social security.
Living on social security. So, little bit of a contradiction there. She should have gone, died in the gutter, just like she'd been telling everyone else they should do all this time. So it's, you know, obviously it's one rule for her and. Other rules for everybody else.
It's clearly a load of bollocks. Well, I do know it's a load of bollocks, because I've met quite a few people who are obviously Randian cultists. Until you did this research though, Anna, I didn't realise the extent that there was a cult around it, because it doesn't make sense if it's an individualistic ideology, hyper individualistic ideology. Why would anybody form a cult or join a cult under its rubric? It makes no sense, does it? It's like totally there's a contradiction right at the heart of it there.
Yeah.
Given the fact, and it was a cult based on a chain of bullying, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, some people in cults have a lot of fun, so free love cults and things. But I think this sounded pretty fucking dour.
Yeah, absolutely miserable.
But
the deeper you got.
I've met them, sort of mostly sort of in virtual spaces where they turn up and they've got all the answers.
And they're usually young people as well,
yeah.
Which is why it's surprising that Javid'S seems to be completely still bewitched by it, enough to the point where he will take this massive risk for him personally, for his career, for the Tories, and for the health of the nation, and for the world, actually, because if the virus is allowed to just wildly replicate through a partially vaccinated population, the chances of us getting a vaccine-resistant variant becomes ever more likely. I mean, can you imagine the consequences for the world if in a few weeks' time we have a new variant and the vaccine is just useless for everyone in the world?
Wasted.
And it was the Tories that did it, right? So he must be absolutely in the thrall of this stupid person, Rand, to make a crazy, insane decision like that.
Yeah.
And it's usually the young people, they get into it, and as they grow up and get a little bit more mature, they realise it's shit. Yeah. But he hasn't realised it's shit yet. I mean, how immature is this man?
I remember he was a Chancellor of the Exchequer. Because, as I said, it chimes with neoliberalism, and he was a neoliberal chancellor. And neoliberalism, it's like Randianism, opposes any kind of state intervention. And collectivism in general, including trade unions and so forth. So you can see why he might, as an ex-kind of city banker and ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer and a committed neoliberal, he might well subscribe to the monstrous and stupid doctrine of, well, I call it objectivism. And objective is the very last thing that it is. It's very hard to find any other explanation for why he would take such a decision and then impose it on the Cabinet. Of course, I should mention, just as a point of detail, that in Wales, masks are still mandatory on public transport and healthcare settings, and probably in the shops for a while.
That's because we've got some sensible people in
charge.
And
Scotland the same, and on London transport, of course, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, instructed Transport for London, which he has jurisdiction over, to enforce mask wearing on buses and the tube. So. Plus, as you say, there's popular support for continuing with that measure for a while yet. Instead of giving a conflicting message, be sensible, we advise you to wear it, but you don't have to if you don't want to. As usual, I'm trying to draw a sort of a useful lesson out of these situations that's got some kind of a general character or an applicability for our understanding beyond the actual piece of current affairs that we're analysing in these Interesting Times podcasts. This is how we can make them a bit different, and how we can use our skill, hopefully to good effect in this context. Because we're not investigative journalists, we have no resources. We have to rely on what's circulating. And what I'd say about it is this: for me, the situation points to certain contradictions. I mean, firstly, within Randianism, that Randianism can produce a cult, a really tight and sort of quite nasty cult, whilst espousing the idea of individual sovereignty and the virtue of selfishness and the sinful nature of any kind of collectivist thinking or activity. At the same time, it's produced a cult. I mean, the tension there is really obvious, the contradiction. And that contradiction must exist in Savage Javid, as Google described him, didn't they? Savage Javid.
Yeah.
After all, he occupied one of the high offices of the United Kingdom state and wielded the power in that office to draw a budget and all the rest of it. So there's the contradictions there straight away. He's doing a job that, according to his core doctrines, his core beliefs, shouldn't even exist. Well, I know you can do some kind of sleight of hand to get round that. But in itself, it points to a contradiction in the Tory party itself that might be even bigger than the contradiction between the Europhiles and the Eurosceptics, which led to David Cameron calling for a referendum, which then resulted in Brexit and all the attendant shit and consequences that we're now in the midst of, and which are developing in more or less catastrophic directions. And it's a conflict between authoritarianism, and Johnson himself has done many authoritarian things since he's been Prime Minister. You know, trying to strengthen the power of the executive away from the power of Parliament and away from the power of the electorate, whilst at the same time espousing freedom talk, you know, and this polemic Freedom Day, you know. And the man himself, of course, is a libertine. He's not a social conservative. He's a libertine. He can't even count how many children he's had by how many women, you know. Yeah. He's a libertine. And so, therefore,
and an opportunist.
Well, he's an opportunist. That's why he turns both ways. Yeah. That's why he faces both ways. Plenty of evidence of an authoritarian streak and a direction and quite a strong effort to accrue power into one small centre of power in the United Kingdom, in an everlasting conservative executive with an ineffectual parliament that it barely has to answer to. That's clearly his ambition, because he's passed so many rulings and so forth, and initiated so many proceedings that move in that direction. At the same time, the man's a libertine, not a social conservative. But of course, it is the Conservative Party, and it's got a great huge number of social conservatives. You know, people who do not want customs to change, who will push back against, I don't know, gay marriage, gender equality, recognition of institutional racism, and making policies and passing measures to mitigate that. And they'll oppose that because they want everything to stay the same, customs-wise, culture-wise, social conservatism. Of course, anybody like that will vote Conservative. Yeah. So you've got this kind of weird mixture of sort of quasi-libertarians like Javid as a Randian, with its emphasis on total individual freedom, and of course Dominic Raab is a Randian, he's a confessed Randian as well. You know, permanent adolescence, the two of them, I suppose. And it is terrifying, you know, that they can be in high offices of state. So on the one hand, libertarians on the one hand, the authoritarians and social conservatives on the other. And that not only is that tension, that contradiction, shot right the way through conservatism, you know, and of course that transpires also in the economic realm, you know, with the notions of freedom that accompany neoliberalism, even though that's the freedom that they preach for is the freedom of the rich to exploit everybody else without the government telling them to back off a bit.
Yeah, that's what they mean by
that's freedom. What they mean, you know. But of course, to be consistent, they have to pretend to extend the notions of freedom to the population as a whole. You know, they say you are free to drag yourself up by your bootstraps and become the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. Of course, nobody ever does, you know, without coming to the candidacy without a prior fortune or very rich backers. You know, that's what that means. But nevertheless, it has to pay lip service to freedom as a part of its economic doctrine. You know, but Johnson said it, the freedom to paint your front door any colour you like. And I think, well, big deal, you know. What about the freedom to breathe? What about the freedom to you know, to breathe clean air? What about the freedom to get an education without being in a lifetime of debt? What about the freedom to organise labour with your friends and your comrades, and produce cooperative enterprises? What about the freedom to protest, which of course they are busy dismantling?
Yeah, and the freedom to have a good quality health care.
Of course.
Which they're busy privatising.
If you're dead or sick, your freedom is extremely attenuated. In the case of dead, it's abolished. You know. And of course that's why, you know, the freedom to not wear a mask becomes kind of stupid, because it's a freedom that could take from somebody their freedom to 5, 10 years, 20 years of life. You know. But
the amount of people who are sustaining long-term damage, which could affect them for the rest of their lives, it's
quite high.
Yeah.
They're talking about 1 in 5, even if they've got fairly mild symptoms, of younger people getting organ damage, or the kidney or lung, and the 2 commonest damages, which is going to be there. It's like actual organic damage, so that organ's damaged for the rest of your life. You know.
Yeah.
So. But of course, now the irony, and you laughed when I told you this, Anna. It was on the news earlier this morning. Javid, Savage Javid. Just a little aside here, Anna was using Google Dictate to type something.
I was just dictating in his name, and that was like, it auto-corrected it to Savage Javid.
And that's what we're going to call him from now on. Google has christened him Savage Javid. Anyway, Savage.
Because in those photographs later on, I'm just like, that's exactly what he looked like as well.
Yeah, look, Dr. Evil. Yeah. Sky News portrayed him as Dr. Evil.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Anyway, Savage Javid, it's announced this morning, contracted COVID yesterday.
So funny, because Javid's going to be celebrating a Freedom Day with COVID.
Yeah. Well, so like he's been vaccinated twice, but he still caught it. He said he don't feel very ill. But of course, they've all been pinged in the cabinet because he was in meetings yesterday, and they've all been pinged. They've got to isolate. That's Johnson and some of the other high Tories, and of course Javid himself have got to self-isolate. But she said they've got out of it. They said Downing Street's a part of a trial where they wouldn't isolate. What they would do is they would have rapid testing every morning when they go into the office. They won't sort of mix socially outside of office hours, but they will go to work. So they are going to be going to Downing Street on the excuse that they're a part of this trial, where they're trialling like rapid testing first thing in the morning in offices as a way of getting the economy going and not making people...
I wonder how the people who were going to catch the virus from them in that working environment are going to feel about that.
Well, they're having a test, and if they test negative, if they test positive, they then have to go home or to hospital or whatever.
Unless, of course, that's just a big fat lie.
Unless it's a big fat lie, which wouldn't surprise me. And, you know, it does look like an excuse. And as you said, this is not a very good look for them, is it?
No.
I mean, I do think that the beginning of the end with this lot, to be honest with you. Whether they'll manage it by just getting rid of Johnson's another matter, we will see on that.
But the good thing is that this decision about Freedom Day and everyone taking off their masks and getting the virus, it's not really, it's all the Tories are in for this one. It's not just Johnson, is it, this time?
It's going to tie all of them.
This story broke just a few minutes before we left the house this morning, so we just had a quick look to see how it had been reported about, oh well, you know, these folks, these high-up folks don't really have to isolate like everybody else because they're kind of special, and there's a sort of, we're going to just get round it by some testing type thing.
It comes across like that.
But the interesting thing was not the report, but how it was reported.
Yeah.
Now, we saw this. It was a Sky News report, just a very short report, and the presenter didn't just say, oh, they're not really isolating because of this, this and this, just suck it up, fuck off, folks. he did actually say, I did all present it in a way that this is going to invite criticisms from Labour, and it's going to be, he was telling the audience what to think about this, and he said, what you need to look at here is the fact that there's one rule for them and a different rule for you. And it was it wasn't just presented as, oh, it's all fine, and you know, poor them, they've got COVID, isn't that just a little bit unlucky, but our good chaps leading the country to victory. But it was, I thought that was very telling, actually.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, you were definitely being nudged. It was fairly subtle and fairly gentle. For mainstream media, it was more subtle than they usually are. But it was definitely a nudge into thinking, well, maybe this is not a good look, maybe. And I keep noticing that I think they've turned on him. Yeah. And you know, I think they're showing the beginnings of it, and they expect it to accelerate if they continue with the trend. And I mean, they have made a pig's ear, and the only way Johnson's able to cope with this is by turning in both directions, by pretending to be a libertarian, and dog whistling people who are craving some sort of authoritarianism. And between them, they do a very good coordinated act in that manner. But it's going to come home to roost.
Yeah, because the disaster is coming. It's going to be a massive, epic disaster in about, say, 2 or 3 months' time. And you know, how the government going to look when they have to have another lockdown? You know, if it gets to the point where the hospitals have just collapsed, even if the deaths are low, but if the people needing treatment get more and more and more, and they can't cope, they're just going to have to. And then, you know, then what? Are people still going to have faith in them then?
Yeah,
what if
I think it is dwindling, not fast enough. Their ability to survive, you know, and Teflon, you know, to come away with nothing sticking to them, it just continues to astonish me. And the ability of the public to keep giving him the benefit of the doubt astonishes me. But I think they might be at the beginning of the end in some ways. It's a pity it's just leaving a vacuum, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, Savage Javid. And he's done us a favour just by showing us all the fucking contradictions.
Yeah.
And you can start looking for them in other places and you'll see them, and you'll get a better understanding. Always look for the contradictions, folks. Just look for the contradictions within parties, within schisms, within factions, within groups of movers and shakers, within classes, within ideological groupings and congregations and all the rest of it. Look for the contradictions. And that way you find that things get exposed, the nature of things gets exposed. And this is a particularly good example, I think, of that, you know. And it's like the components of the contradiction are themselves contradictions. It's contradictions all the way down.
And I felt quite pleased, even though it's been hard work trawling through the bile of Randianism, to get this window into Javid's mind, because he's so open about what his ideology is. It's like we can. There's loads of material about objectivism and Rand and interviews and all the books, of course, and everything, so that you can really get a handle on what is motivating him. Because the big thing about the whole sort of Tory saga over the last few years, it's like, what the fuck are they doing? Why are they doing that? It's like you just look at what they're doing and it just makes no sense, and it's really confusing. And again, this, if I didn't know that he was a Randian and sort of understood what I understand now, I'd be looking at this like, why get rid of masks when we know how effective they are?
Yeah.
What a stupid thing to do, doesn't make any sense at all. So it's nice to almost like have a little map now. It's like I have my at least I have a Javid map. So whenever he does these things, it's not confusing. It's like, oh yes, this is just in line with that kind of crazy ideology he believes.
Yeah, well, he wants people to exercise their freedom, to be utterly selfish, because this is what really matters in the universe. And asked a comment about being sick, you know, feeling not very well with the COVID. He says, well, the symptoms are not too bad. He has been vaccinated. He probably won't fall too ill.
Even if they were bad, I doubt he'd admit it.
Yeah, he probably wouldn't admit it. He says anyway, but he says, "Oh, the symptoms are not too bad." He said, "And you needn't bother to wear your masks, folks. Anyway, it's great. It's fine. Don't wear your mask." You know, you can see like it's a symbol of the Randian selfishness, which, you know, selfishness is a virtue. That is the tenet. It's the one tenet. You can work everything out from that notion. Yeah. There are people in the world who believe that selfishness is the prime virtue. You know, and he's one of them, and he sits in a high office of state, as is Dominic Raab, who also sits in a high office of state. He's the Foreign Secretary. If you're not scared, you should be. You're not paying attention.
Yeah. Well, let's just hope that they've just gone too far this time. I mean, it is going to be awful. I can see nothing but darkness ahead, unfortunately, as a result of this decision, and it's going to be firmly on their shoulders and the blood's going to be on their hands, and let's just hope everyone can actually realise that this time.
Of course, some people will love them for it. Just another piece of advice, since I took it upon myself to advise you about the examination of contradictions in any situation you stare at. There's also, when it comes to these politicians, to not underestimate how utterly morally depraved they are. You know, don't think they're kind of nice people who are a bit misled. There is real moral depravity at the heart of our politics. And lives are disposable. And in the modern situation, I was going to say it's not that obvious, but it is that obvious. Yeah. And your life is disposable. And it's people like this who sent young men in their thousands and hundreds of thousands over the trenches to be shot, and just calculated 100,000 will die today and will move forward afoot. World War I, World War II. The moral depravity of concentration camps. Iraq, the moral depravity of completely destabilising a region on trumped up charges, of which our government was a party. Do not underestimate it. Your life is disposable from their point of view. And don't be tempted by the manners and maybe the sense of humour and the clown act of Johnson into thinking there's anything other than utter moral depravity working through these arseholes.
Yeah, at best you're just a unit of labour.
Yeah.
And at worst they just want you gone.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, the clinically vulnerable people are just being tossed out to die, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
The advice is to, well, maybe don't go near someone who isn't vaccinated, maybe, and do that, because of course everyone's wearing a big sign saying I'm vaccinated or I'm not vaccinated, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know.
And the other thing, of course, is that all this is to save the economy, but
it's going to be trashed anyway by
the stupid
thing they're doing.
1.5 million people are in isolation for 10 days, so they're not working, are they? They're not delivering the school meals or the post or
emptying the bins or keeping the supermarket shelves full,
you know, and
delivering food. No.
So their answer to that is, the app is too strong. We'll tweak the algorithm so it's not so strong. So okay, so that means you're calculating for some more infections then. Anyway, I think we should stop.
Oh, that's a good dose of indignation for you there.
Well, I mean, I suppose
we've been steamed up about this for days.
Well, as well as the moral depravity, the other thing you need to consider is the sheer incompetence. None of these people are that bright.
Yeah.
If they're followers of Randianism, they're definitely not that bright.
They're definitely not bright, no. Oh, God.
Anyway, we're going to love you and leave you. Yeah. Thank you for listening.
I hope you have a nice day, and you're having a bit of sunshine where you are.
Yeah, and we'll be back soon. We've got many things on the anvil.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting just to see where we're up to in, say, 4 or 5 weeks' time, where Chris Whitty says things will be a lot worse. So we'll see how worse they are by then. Anyway, I hope everyone found that interesting, and we'll speak to you again soon.